Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. This is Season 3. It's amazing, isn't it, that we're already at Season 3. We've really enjoyed producing Seasons 1 and 2, and we are really thankful now that we can launch Season 3. As we started to put together Season 3, it became clear that there's kind of a God-made idea that runs through a lot of these podcasts. So I would call the theme of Season 3 is really courage. So we're going to have some interesting guests who have faced persecution in other countries, and we're going to kick off Season 3 with the examination of a best-selling book that talks about the battle for the American mind, especially in schools. So we hope you really enjoy Season 3. It's been fun, like I said, interacting with everyone. And people ask, when's the next season of Cultivate coming out? So here it is. Welcome to Season 3. I'm your host, Ty Fisher, and I get to have a conversation with a really good friend today. We have the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, David Goodwin, on the line. David and I have known each other for how long?
Oh, boy, 20 years maybe?
20 years.
Are we that far yet?
Yeah, but I mean, really, I did some work for the association over the last few years. I actually took some part-time work there, I think like the month before COVID hit, and that was quite a time. But interestingly enough, during that time when, all of that uncertainty and everything weird in the culture was happening, what we've seen is just, what would be the right word to say what we've seen in classical Christian education since that time, David?
Oh, an awakening maybe?
Yeah. I would say awakening. I almost thought of explosion, but that has like negative connotations.
Yeah.
So,
well, if we're going to name the book Battle for the American Mind, we got to stay away from the metaphors get mixed.
Oh no, but that's one of the number of people involved in classical Christian education has grown drastically over the last few years. The number of startup schools has really risen over the last few years. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There have been many things happening outside the movement that have been pushing people in, but one of the things that happened kind of inside the movement that drew people in was a book that David worked on with Pete Hegseth from Fox News called The Battle for the American Mind. So now I can say this: not only is David a friend, and not only is he the president of ACCS, he's also a New York Times best-selling author. Was that one of those things that you had on like a goal list, David?
No, that was definitely not something I was thinking. I will say that.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about the book, just let's hear your story. How did you get involved in classical Christian education, and what's your path been along the way in classical Christian education?
Well, I was brought up on a farm in Idaho, had public school education like so many in our movement. I knew something was lacking coming through that system, but when I went to college, I realized, I wasn't really well prepared coming from a rural area. And so my sister, who was applying for a job at a startup classical Christian school in the mid-90s, probably very similar to the one I think you started at in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
I didn't know what classical Christian education was, but she told me a little bit about it, and I got involved in helping to market that school because I thought it would be a good thing to have something of an academically rigorous school in the state. And at the time, I had no idea what I was stepping into. I didn't realize that the entirety of education and what I thought about it was wrong. And so it took quite a few years over the course between about 1995 and 2003. We had employed a gentleman by the name of Andrew Kern, who
Goodwin.
Yes, he's a good friend and now quite a well-known speaker and author in the classical Christian movement. But at the time, he worked for us, and he kind of discipled me in changing my view of what education was, and he developed that over the course of 6 or 8 years. And then by a turn of providence, our school fell onto some hard times. And because I was the business guy on the board and the board had some challenges, I was pulled into running the school. And so once I started running the school, the theory and philosophy that Andrew had taught me had to come down to some real practice. And fortunately, there had been some great teachers hired at the school, took me under their wings, handed me great books and started me reading the great books. And that got me a little bit more exposure to classical education, to where I felt like I could bring something unique, and that I was a total outsider with no, guys like you, Ty, you have something of a more of a literary background. I have a business background, an MBA. So for me, kind of acting as a translator between the classical Christian world and the wider, more mainstream world is sort of where my sweet spot is. So I started writing, and that's how the battle for the American mind ultimately came about.
Well, just thinking about your business background, it's got to be pretty interesting for you to be leading a classical Christian school over the last 20 years, because there's probably so many times when you hear about something happening at another school with a literary or a theological guy who's leading, and you go like, oh, well, that's not going to work. Like, that's the worst business idea I've ever heard. But you were leading the Ambrose School, and under your leadership, the school grew to around 600 or something like that. And then what's happened at Ambrose since COVID?
Well, it's so much of the movement has really. We're facing this nationwide, both at Ambrose and nationally. As you know, we spent a fair amount of mental energy on trying to get other people to understand what we were doing, to appreciate what we were doing in the classical movement. And things have kind of gone 180 since probably 2020, where now there's a lot of attention on classical education. We're still wanting to get the word out and let people know about it, but effectively, we've had to shift a lot of resources, as Ambrose has, to serving the people who are coming, because we've got so many. It's overwhelming us. So, like this year, when I took on the association, and I think it was 2015, I think we had around 220 members or 250 members, something like that. We just passed the 500 member mark this year, and most of that has come in the last 3 years, just as people have sought. Members, by the way, are schools. So these are institutional members, and they've been growing and trying to fill the need now for the last 3 or 4 years in kind of a resource stretched way.
Yeah. It almost feels like a triage. There's the hospitals are just being flooded at this point, because there's both an expulsive force. Like, there's a local middle school, and I joke with people that I don't know what they're doing at that public middle school, but there's somebody there I should be having dinner with, just to thank them for the families that they're sending our way. Like, they're incredible families who really just want a good education in a sane Christian environment. And most of Lancaster County is a sane Christian environment. Somebody's pushing the buttons that are making families hit the eject button from public education. So, and you're seeing on one coast what we're seeing on the other. So we have a number of families moving in from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Christians who don't have to work anyplace, and they're moving out to Lancaster because they just don't want to live on the East Coast. And I know that you're both blessed as a homeowner with the price of your house in Boise, but learning to navigate all of the Californians that have abandoned their state and moved to Idaho.
Yeah, certainly we have seen an influx, and the migration that's occurring around the country as people move for those two reasons. One reason is that some states have gone a little crazy, as you might say, and
Well,
that drives people out.
When you get to California and New York, maybe the adjective "little" is not right. Maybe they're way crazy.
Charitably, yes,
Yeah.
I would say it's crazy enough that it drives driving mass numbers away. And then you add that to the fact that now people after COVID are capable of working remotely more,
Mm-hmm.
and it has caused certain regions to explode. But even within the regions, so that, one of the interesting bits of migration, one of the schools in Southern California, Trinity Classical, they've sent a number of families up our way who've been fleeing California. But they've been able to replace them with families that are in California and have just hit their limit in the public schools, like
Yep.
you said. There's only so much you can take, and it's one thing when they're back in the old days when you and I started this, we didn't like the fact that they were teaching evolution to our kids in the public schools, right? Now they're trying to turn boys into girls and all that.
Yeah.
For the good old days.
Oh, for the nostalgia of XX and XY. So I was going to say, with this book, you kind of hit the nail on the head how did you land this plane at exactly the right time? Because it's almost like this book was timed to come out when this cultural chaos just broke out. Well,
I can tell you it was not intentional on our part. We were still in the mindset. So the work on the book came out, of course, in the June of 2022. But the work on the book began initially as a documentary on Fox Nation. And that work began in January or February of 2020, which, if you do the math, that was just before COVID hit. So we had no idea that was before George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
That was before the, Virginia's school board catastrophes. It was before a lot of the wokeness that was moving into the schools in forms of transgender work. And so none of it did we know when we started. As we went, the hardest part of writing the book was that as the news unfolded, and of course my co-author Pete Heggseth was pretty close to what was going on in the news since he worked in New York at Fox. We were writing nude paragraphs in throughout the book to try and connect with what was going on, because it was fitting so well. It just worked out that way. And then, of course, when we released the book, the editors we were all trying. It was like trying to jump on a moving train. As you're probably aware, Ty, you've written a number of books and been party to others, and I know that the process takes well over a year.
Yeah.
So we were getting to the end of the process. The train was moving, and we had to jump on at some point. And so the 24th, I think, was the day in June last year that it released. The market was primed. People were thinking of education, and this was, as well, Ty, one of the problems we've had for years in the classical Christian movement is that when you get in and understand classical Christian education, you realize that, education is much bigger than people have any idea or imagination about. It's because the progressives narrowed the focus of education down to just job preparation that it got really small, and it became almost a trivial matter that you'd send your kids off on a yellow bus in the morning and they come back at night, and eventually they'll be ready for college. They'll get a college degree and step into a job. So it narrowly got slivered down to this, gnat on a buffalo kind of thing. And when you start unpeeling it and realizing that was a progressive lie, that's not what education is at all. Its purpose is much greater. In fact, it's a civilizing purpose. Mm-hmm. On which the entirety of our civilization rests. When it gets that big, suddenly you have a whole new story to tell, and that story is fascinating to people, I think.
Well,
certainly was to me when I discovered it.
Yeah, and I can't tell you all about everything in the book, but is there a way that you can tell people just a summary of what is the battle for the American mind? What's the book about?
Well, the book chronicles the development of American education, which people tend to believe it's just always been the way it is. I mean, I think that this is kind of one of the great myth busting books.
Yeah.
It started to be education as we know it today in about 1912, or there, of course, were some precursors to that with Horace Mann in the 1800s. But really, the progressives start up in 1912, and 1905, 1912, 1915, Woodrow Wilson, kind of right in there. And most of us, if you remember back to your high school textbook on American history, you'll remember that little green box or whatever it was in your textbook that said, "Oh, the progressive era was this time in the early 1900s when child labor was ended and the unions became a thing, and sort of the treatment of the socialization of America in kind of a progressive context was created." And then they'd like you to believe that the progressive era ended, but it really didn't. It took over. And the way it took over.
Yeah, the schools that I grew up around were consolidated in the 40s in Indiana. So all of the, the small country schools all consolidated into larger schools, but it wasn't in the 19-teens that didn't hit Indiana until like the 1930s and 40s.
Well, certainly the final effects that you saw were that late.
I was in pretty rural Indiana, by the way.
Yeah, and I think rural America did kind of slowly morph over there. But we're still seeing the transformation of American schools. You're seeing it with what they're trying to teach now on wokeness in the schools. But to go back to that time, I originally got involved in researching the book because I happened to attend a lecture by a college professor who read a quote from a progressive in that era. It was taken out of a magazine called The New Republic, which is still published, but at the time it was just the dawn of the New Republic, and it was the one of two primary progressive publications, and it was kind of where all the thought that preceded the movement came out. And this quote said something about not allowing parents to have complete control over what they called the plasticity of the child. In other words, how the child would grow and come to learn things. And that word plasticity, its meaning is obvious from its word, but it was curious to me what it actually was talking about. And since the quote was short, I wanted to find the magazine. So I went to the library here and asked, and they had hard copies of all those magazines. So I said, "Could you just bring them out?" And this was many years ago, before Google could kind of index all this stuff for you. I'd say many years ago, about 15 years ago now.
Were you like Gandalf, like when he's looking around for those in those old scrolls and blowing dust off of things? Is that what you were doing?
It was actually literally like that. I do remember when the librarian on the fourth floor brought these things out to me and set them down. Dust literally did fall out of them and kind of clouded around the table a little bit. So it was kind of funny that way. So I had never done this. Business school, you don't do research like this. So I just started. I figured this is going to be a quick job finding this article, because I knew roughly the 5 or 6 year period. The thing published every 2 weeks, So it was going to take me a little while, but I figured it's an education article, so there can't be many of those. They were too busy forming unions and doing things like that. And sure enough, every issue had an education section in it. And I was thinking, why are these progressives so fixated on education? And you start reading them and you realize this is about the takeover of civilization. This is not about trying to get these kids good jobs. That's the smoke screen, or the dust screen, as it were, given the condition of these volumes. But that was the smoke screen, is that they were about getting kids jobs in the industrial economy, when in fact what they were doing is trying to reshape society. And so I started finding, just article after article. I finally did find the actual quote, but it led into a bunch more. And so that caused me to say, hey, nobody's telling this story. The story of the progressives is always about things that really weren't their biggest accomplishment. Their biggest accomplishment was taking over society through the schools, because they understood this thing called Paideia.
Yep. Yeah.
And that was clincher.
They understood a very important part of Christian civilization or of any civilization better than the Christians of that day understood it. That they
Yeah.
had to have this thing called Paideia, that's a word that's used in classical education. I'm going to have you talk. Let's start with that. Help our listeners to understand, when you say the word Paideia, this Greek word, what do you mean by it?
Well, that the word is used in Ephesians 6, where Paul is telling the Ephesian fathers to raise their children and the word in Greek is Paideia, of the Lord, but it gets translated fear, admonition, education, training, instruction,
Nurture.
because there's no English word for it.
Yeah.
On top of that, a guy named Igor Werner decided he was going to write a volume on what Paideia actually meant. And so if you're going to ask me to actually define it, Ty, that's going to be hard, given that what is that volume? I think it's 3 volumes and several thousand pages.
Yeah, I'm doing this from my office, and I'm looking at volume 1 of Paideia here. That's a 350 page book. 3 volumes, folks, on the history of how that one word has played out in culture. Isn't that incredible? So
yeah, and it's a word most people don't know.
So I when I talk about it, I like to go back to ancient Greece and just say that the polis, these different city-states, each of them, they weren't like we think of a city like Lancaster or Boise or Los Angeles, just like a geographic area. And you can have all kinds of different people and ideas and stuff like that in that geographic area. The Greeks, when they were talking about the polis, when they were talking about their city-states, those city-states had an end in mind. They had a kind of person that they were trying to produce. And everything in that culture, everything in that polis worked together in Sparta to make really good soldiers, in Athens to make really thoughtful philosophers and people that were good at rowing triremes. So it's a word that if you want to like take all of those English words that you mentioned, shove them together and just say, something that enculturates a way of life into a group of people. That's kind of what Paideia is, right?
Well, it is. And the thing is that everyone has Paideia. Mm-hmm. Everyone has some training in who they are and what they are. I think what the Athenians did that was it probably plays more into the establishment of Western culture more so than any other action in history, is that the Athenians decided they could be intentional about it. Mm-hmm. Instead of just training dogmatically Spartan soldiers or Persians or Egyptians or whomever, the Greeks looked at it and said, what if we trained free men who didn't just do what they were told, but could think for themselves and could represent themselves in a democracy, because that's, of course, the experiment they were trying to pull off there. And so their intentional Paideia that was able to cultivate rhetoric, the training of someone who could speak well and think well, and logic, who could think rationally through things being said, these were skills or abilities that would allow a free state to exist, and this had never been really conceptualized before.
So you talked about this group of people called the progressives, and of course that's a word that's used in politics today, but you're not meaning like Chuck Schumer or AOC or something like that. Talk about who these people, the progressives, were.
Well, the progressives were an interesting amalgamation of socialists who were secular humanists, really, or atheistic humanists like John Dewey, Charles Potter. There's a vast group of them in the early 20th century. But they kind of joined forces with guys like Dallas Lord Sharp or many others who were actually clergy. They were part of the mainstream church in America, which now has faded. These were the United Methodists and all the mainstream, the mainline churches.
Yeah, mainline churches, which of course comes from the East Coast. It's the train that goes out of Philadelphia. It goes down the main line, and those were the denominations you would see. Episcopalians.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. The Episcopalians, the Methodists, every little town along the main line would have a church from that denomination.
Yeah, and because these churches at the time were representative of a pretty big chunk of Christianity in America, now they've faded to a great degree. These denominations had liberalized for quite some time, but at the time they represented a pretty big number of people in the United States, and those churches had been enveloped since the late 19th century in the social gospel, which was this idea that really Christianity doesn't need to be so much about saving souls and being concerned about who was going to heaven or who's going to hell. It needed to be more concerned about social issues like temperance or how we deal with women's rights or things like that. And so that became sort of a natural connection point between the atheistic humanism and these mainline churches. And they fused together and formed the progressive movement. So the most notable progressive president we've ever had, of course, is Woodrow Wilson. And interestingly, he's been called the most religious president we've ever had because he was the president of Princeton University for a time. And interestingly, the reason he's called that is because he's in this mainline area. And so he was part of that lobe, that half of the progressive movement.
So it all goes back to the Presbyterians, David.
Sadly, despite the warnings of a guy by the name of Macon.
Yeah, he was warning out along the main line. So we talked about Paideia and we talked about the progressives. What is their plan to transform that Paideia? And is what you're saying that they had when you were, shuffling your way through the dusty backlogs of the new republic? Did they believe that if they could just implement this plan of public education and change the Paideia, that a utopia, like heaven on earth, was at stake? Is that what they were really saying?
Yes. And, of course, all of us want to live in a better place. So it's not that they had the monopoly on utopia. It was the idea that man could create such a thing. In other words, the old Christian idea was that what man can aspire to is to live according to Christian principles. And therefore, morality and those sorts of things were seen as a good because that is a way to have a better society, is to have people in it who followed God's law. That's different than what the progressives were saying, which was, no, we don't need God anymore. This is almost directly from Charles Potts. We should have been doing this all along. We should have been building a better world. We can build heaven on earth without God because we don't need God. We're now in control. It was kind of an extension of evolution. If evolution, they believe, slowly developed over time and natural selection through kind of a mindless process, humans, who were the highest of the creatures, humans could evolve to the point where they were able to take over the process and actually manipulate evolution to make us a great society. And that would be driven by humans. But that's quite different in principle from the founding of America, where we were too concerned that if man got enough power, he was going to turn into another tyranny. And so in founding fathers, in an effort to avoid tyranny created by bicameral legislature and, separation of powers and all this other material that they set up to protect that, the Bill of Rights, the progressives didn't see any purpose in any of that because there really wasn't a threat. All there was it was holding us back.
Yeah, if men are angels, why do we need a separation of powers anyway?
Right.
Because what
it does is slow us down.
Right.
And if we want to be creators of the new heaven on earth, we need to have freedom to progress. And that's why they're called the progressives.
So So I'm involved in a family that's very involved in all different kinds of education, but a good number of the family members are involved in public education, and they're really good folks. But when they look back, when they think back about this era, when they talk about the roots of public education, they don't go all the way back to the beginning in Massachusetts, where the first public school law was called, the Old Deluder Satan Act, which said you had to establish schools so that people could read the Bible, because if they can't read the Bible, they're going to be deluded by Satan. That was the beginning of the public schools. They don't talk about that, but they talk about the public schools as a way of like raising people up in society, in bringing about a society where there was a greater deal of equality, or that by hard work and education you could, lack of a better term, make it in America. And I think that's the idea that they have. How has this part of the story that you're telling gotten so lost? Like, why did you have to blow the dust off when you're going to research this? How did Christians get tricked into this?
Well, if you're a fan of old westerns, you probably remember some cowboy or some Indian who is trying to escape, and he kind of uses a bush or something to kind of wipe out his footprint.
Yeah.
It's very similar. It is very similar to what the progressives did, since they are the ones, and this is a historical fact. This isn't some strange conspiracy theory, but you can look in any mainstream textbook and it'll tell you that the modern American education system is called the progressive education system because they built it. And so once you own the mechanism that trains future generations, you can write around the story, and they just happen to neglect in the textbooks that this is what they did. They didn't want Paideia to be a thing that was known. An interesting fact about this, obviously, is again the fusion of the mainline denominations in the progressive movement. Well, as you know, Ty, very few people know this, but you circa 1905, so that means you probably graduated from college. If you were a thinker or scholar at that time, you graduated from college in the 19th century. Almost to a man, every one of them who graduated from college was fluent in Greek and Latin, because they had to be. The college entrance exams were in Greek and Latin. And so they knew Paideia, but the fundamentalist evangelicals who maybe weren't as educated didn't necessarily know it. So it was almost that the entire domain of the progressives were the only people who really understood Paideia, because they were the educated class in some way. And the other Christians really weren't as familiar with it. And so it was pretty easy to deceive everyone and just make the concept of Paideia go away.
So basically what you're saying is the people that win the wars write the history.
That would have been a short way of saying it, yeah.
So
yep.
You've talked about this growth in the number of classical Christian schools, but sometimes, I run into people and they'll say like, oh, we understand these, all of this is happening out there and it's terrible, but not with the school in our area, or not with the teachers at our public school. What kind of advice does this book, or do you give to people with that kind of objection to looking for another educational option?
Well, I think the key here is that the things you see on the surface can look better in small rural schools, right? You may not have somebody trying to hide transgender pornography in the library from your kids, or you may not have drag shows, and so you figure this is really a city problem, not a country problem.
Or you might.
Yeah, or you might, right? And that's why we're growing so fast, is that people are suddenly seeing it happen in their rural districts as well. But my point is that most people look at the surface and try, what is the bright, shiny thing that is a problem today in the news, and do I see it in my school? And when they don't see it in their school, they assume that problem isn't there. The issue is when you start to understand what's in the battle for the American mind, and when you read the narrative there, the problem is so much deeper than people realize. It's growing from very deep roots. Mm-hmm. And those roots are in every single school, public school in this country, and to some extent every private school, because it's very hard to escape the superstructures that were put in place by the progressives.
Right.
But, I will guarantee you, if your kid is in a public school, they are predominantly influenced by the progressive idea of education. There's no way around it at this point. The progressives own all of the infrastructure that prepares teachers, that prepares or runs state school superintendents, that runs local accreditation systems. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The whole thing it's swimming in a progressive bath. So it's going to be progressive water.
Yeah. So when you and I got into this many years ago, into classical Christian education, I always looked at what we were doing as kind of like a vanguard type thing. We're the first people running out there onto the battlefield, to usually painted blue and a little bit crazy, to call upon some Braveheart images. We're
mixing in the berserkers. Or something.
We're basically out there high on classical Christian education and running at the other army with our meat cleavers and things like that. So it was to hit that Braveheart note. At some points, maybe more in the last 5 years, I've wondered, is classical Christian education a rear guard action? Are we protecting a group of kids so that they can carry this story, the story of the gospel in Western civilization through a very dark time? So, and people have been writing about this, right? So you get people that are saying, run out on the field, be like St. Boniface. ACCS has an award that they give to folks that do that. And then there are others saying, get ready to hunker down, like St. Benedict. Rod Dreher wrote that famous book, The Benedict Option. So when you think about where this battle is right now, this battle for the American mind, which of those options are you telling people to take? Or when is it a time to be a Benedict, and when is it a time to be a Boniface?
Oh boy, that's a tough question, because we're in the throes of battle right now, and I think that's why the book has resonated so well, is that people can see that we're in the throes of the battle. It's a hard time to devise strategy when you're already in the midst of it. I think there's merits to both.
Do we have another choice to be out of the midst of it?
Well, no, I think there is a third choice. So the first choice you brought up is sort of a berserker run into the American culture with banners waving and start a fight. The second, of course, is a defensive posture. It's sequester yourselves in communities and try and do what we can. The third is sadly what's happening too often in Christendom, and that is try and blend in, try and fit in, and make the
salt less salty.
Yeah, so that it isn't so offensive when people taste it. It's happening all over the place, and obviously you can see it on the blogosphere, Twitter sphere, whatever else. So those are your three positions. We know that the one that says, let's try and be winsome and not offend anyone and try and find points of agreement, come together, that time has passed. Anybody who thinks that is a winning strategy at this point is going to soon find themselves consumed.
Yeah.
The salt won't be salty, and therefore it'll be discarded.
Yeah, when you can't agree whether objective reality or male and female is a definable thing, I don't know where you're going to have that starting point of agreement, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some who would say, okay, we can agree to disagree. The problem is that now, if you're going to agree to disagree, but their idea is that they're going to force you to raise your children in a certain way, or they're going to take, it's like the statement that Biden made the other day about children being the property effectively of the government. He was basically saying they're not the property of the parents. At that point, any kind of affable agree to disagree situation is a fool's errand. You're just going to end up absorbed by the machine. So that leaves us with only the other two options, the Benedict option or the fight option. I think it's a little of both. In the book, we recommend some, again, the Lord sort of put things together with this book that we would never have thought of up front. I wrote a big chunk of the middle of the book because it was my research on what American education is and what classical education is. Pete wrote a lot about the rise of the Frankfurt School and the development of critical race theory in the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And we needed to end it somehow. And so we were having a conversation one day saying, well, we've got to offer a solution here. And I think that's what you're referring to, Ty, is what is the course action we should take. Pete happened to have been, he was a military officer in three of our conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. And he worked in counterinsurgency,
Okay.
which is the part of the military that kind of tries to work within communities and get them to come on board with the Americans instead of the Taliban. And so he had quite an experience in the insurgency. And we realized that that's really what we as Christians are now called to try and do. And it's very similar to what the Christians did in the first century and second century. They remained in an offensive posture, meaning that they were not retreating, but they did so in tight communities that were able to work outside the halls of power. So being political guerrillas is not a likely place that Christianity will ever, at least in the foreseeable future, be able to muster in America, because the progressive state has educated too many kids. And at this point, there's too much of the voting population that sees Christianity as a problem, not a bad thing, not a good thing.
They're in negative world.
So, yes, in Aaron Renn's equation. And so that's why we thought the insurgency was the right answer. Basically, insurgencies operate underground and they undermine the power structure of the progressives, but they do so in subtle, quiet ways. And that's where I think that the Christianity has, the original insurgency was Christianity in the first century and second century. By the third century, they owned Rome, fourth century, really. They took over the very institution that was persecuting them, that killed Christ, right?
Yeah.
So how did they do it? Through a slow insurgency. And it was, to some degree, in Boniface ways, chop down the oak. It was in other senses, like Benedictine ways, where they sequestered into communities, grew together, and supported each other.
Right. Well, and the church ends up going from being a persecuted minority to having because the Roman Empire falls apart, basically filling a vacuum and having more power than the first century Christians could have ever thought of. But there's a river of blood, not blood that was shed by Christians. That happens at some points in history. Christians whose blood was shed by that empire over those centuries. So I'm happy to have to work hard for a long time to have dominion, but how's that other part of what happened instructive for us? And how do we prepare kids for that?
Well, I think it could come to that. I think there's a more dangerous adversary. So, Ty, you and I would not like to be thrown to the lions or put in the gladiator's ring. I don't think either of us would find that to be good, but we would gladly.
It would be short. Let's say it that way.
We would gladly undertake it, both of us. The alternative was for our kids to be lost.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's the greater danger we have at this moment, is that the progressives have never forgotten that if they can take the souls of your kids, they can maintain their power base.
Yeah.
And so the more likely thing that we'll see them being thrown to lions or put in chains, the more likely thing is that they will attempt to take our children.
Right.
Either, we're seeing in Canada already, where parents who resist the LGBTQ agenda have their kids taken away. I think our bigger threat is worse than being thrown to the lions. It's having our children's minds taken and have them lost to the kingdom, because of course the early Christians, the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. They knew that they would be resurrected and they would return. Those who deny the cross aren't going to have that resurrection and that return. And that's what I think is worse than the lions or the chains of Rome.
You know, David, you're in a really unique perspective because you are running the Association of Classical and Christian Schools, and you've seen the growth in that association. How could we pray for you and for the Association of Classical and Christian Schools, and maybe for the movement, just in a general sense?
I think prayer for courage. You know, when the spotlight comes upon you, as it has on classical education recently, I think there's a increased scrutiny, and that drives people to fear being ostracized, or, you know, I think a lot of what we were talking about with the compromises that might come. I think courage is the antidote to that, and I think prayer for courage among our schools and among our faculty, and wisdom, because obviously we're called to be gentle as doves, but wily as serpents. And I think that knowing when to do which is a prayer that our member schools would very much appreciate in this culture and in this environment.
Wow.
So courage and wisdom.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for your time and for the work you did on this book and for your leadership in classical schooling. Thank you for being a guest on our podcast as well.
It was my pleasure. It's good to be on with a friend.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.